In the 90s, before everyone had cell phones, my Girl Scout troop was camping in a state park when a terrible storm came through the area, with major flood warnings. The rangers at the park frantically came through every campsite and evacuated everyone to higher ground. Everyone, that is, except us, and the Boy Scouts in the site next to us. We went to bed with light rain, but woke in the middle of the night to our tents collapsing from the driving rain and water quickly rising. The Boy Scouts, they were about 12 to 16 years old, we were about 7 to 9 years old, helped us quickly pack our site into our cars. Unfortunately, the roads were too dangerous to drive on because we couldn't see how deep the water was, and we really didn't know if any sections of the road had been washed out already. We abandoned all the vehicles and used the map that the scout leaders had to find some place that wouldn't be flooded. A few miles away, there were treehouse cabins that were built around a tree and lofted about 15 feet into the air. It was decided that we needed to move quickly, and that was our best shot. The older boys and the adults carried the smallest girls when it became clear that the wind was preventing them from staying on their feet. The wind and rain soaked everyone through to the skin. We made it to the cabins, and the adults then broke in and raided the emergency supplies there for space blankets. There was no way to build a fire because there was no firewood. It had been an especially dry year, and starting campfires was forbidden due to the risk of starting a forest fire. I remember shivering for hours, all of us girls in the middle of a huddle on the floor with the boys on the outside trying their best to keep us warm. One of the boys ended up asking us if we knew any Girl Scout songs, either camp songs or more of a Girl Scout thing than a Boy Scout thing, or they were just humoring us. We ended up singing every song that we knew, and the leaders then taught us a few more songs that they had learned to keep us occupied. At some point, we convinced the boys to sing in rounds with us too. Morning came, the rain slowed down to a light drizzle, and a ranger showed up assessing damage to the park. He discovered us and immediately drove to get help. They returned with a bunch of trucks and all-terrain vehicles and drove us to a location where doctors were on site to evaluate us. It was sheer luck that none of us had anything worse than the chills. It could have gone a lot worse than it did, and we were unbelievably lucky to have survived it all. We could have easily died in our sleep if the flood had come through all at once instead of slowly rising. If the Boy Scouts hadn't been there, then us small girls could have not made the hike to safety. If we had tried to drive, we would have easily been washed away. Two years ago, while I was tree planting out of a bush camp in Saskatchewan, it was the second last night of our season, and a few of us had been up really late drinking around the fire. After everyone else had gone to bed, I went to my tent to grab another beer before putting out the fire. As I'm getting back out of the tent, I see something running through the center of camp that definitely was not one of the dogs. I duck back inside my tent to grab a flashlight, and as I stand back up, there's a black bear staring right at me, no further than 5 feet away. I run back to the fire and wait for the bear to make a move. Luckily, he decides not to follow me. A few minutes later, I hear the bear trying to get inside our garage box. I head over cautiously, without a flashlight, like a fucking horror movie character, but I can't see the bear anywhere in the nearly pitch black. I get right next to the box, still no sign of the bear, and try to shift the box lid back into place. It isn't until the bear turns his head and I see his eyes that I realize that my hand is inches away from his back paw. Both of us, frozen in fear, stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was more like seconds. This was possibly the most incredible moment I've ever shared with an animal. I could see the intelligence in this bear's eyes, and I could see him sizing up the situation exactly the way I was. I felt a strong connection, and ultimately an understanding as fellow mammals. After this long moment, I shouted and he ran away. I stayed up until about 5 a.m., scaring him away every half hour or so, before waking up at 7 for the last day of our season. TLDR, had an incredible midnight stare down with a black bear, gained a greater appreciation for our place among animals. This is a long one here, but please stick with me. Last year, a friend and I went on a long road trip to New Mexico. We camped most of the way, and our first night we got to camp we spent in the Jefferson National Forest at a campsite in West Virginia. We had found some pamphlets for campsites at a gas station, and we drove out to a place called White Rocks Campground, which was like a 25-plus mile drive up a dirt road into the mountains. We were really in the boonies. On our way in, we saw no cars except for one truck that was behind us for maybe 15 minutes, but then turned down another road. We passed a huge coal factory with a sign that had said, 62 days since an on-site incident. The only people we saw on our drive were standing on the side of the dirt road, huddled around a plastic bin that was on fire. It was all so odd, but we were so excited about camping and being on this trip, we were just laughing about how weird it was instead of not being worried about having A, no cell phone reception, or B, being so deep into the mountains. We finally get to the campground, and it is completely empty. Not a single car or person to be seen, and this campground had about 30 sites. We ended up driving around all of them, trying to spot anyone, but when we realized it was just us, we picked a random site and decided to just stick it out. We got out of the car and stood there and just listened. The silence was startling. I love being in the woods. I've never felt scared or intimidated to be out there, but there was such a different feeling this time. There were no bird sounds. It was just thick, silent woods. This was straight up Blair Witch. It was getting dark quick, and we decided to start a fire and put up the tent to try to get comfortable. My friend was in charge of the tent, and I was putting together the fire. While we were trying to go about our business, we would both stop and listen. My friend made the point that if anyone was going to approach us, at least there were crunchy leaves everywhere for us to hear it coming. See where this might be going? I thought we were just freaking ourselves out, but it really felt like something was watching us. It was actually the first time in my life I've understood what that feeling is. I had goosebumps. I wanted to leave, but I kept my cool for my friend. It turned out she was also initially freaking out, but trying to keep it cool as well. Finally, the fire is started, the tent is up and sleeping bags ready, and the sun had completely set. Sitting around the fire together, the darkness seemed to close in, so close to us that it felt suffocating. My friend brought out a book to read aloud and make us feel more comfortable. While she was reading, I grabbed my headlamp and would occasionally turn it on and look around me. I had had this feeling since we pulled into the campsite that someone was out there, in those woods. It was pitch black, and our fire was a beacon. My friend and I decided, fuck it, let's go to bed. We'll just go to sleep quick, then pack up in the morning and GTFO. That was our thought process. We put out the fire and decided to grab the one knife we had on us that was still in the car and keep it beside me in the tent. After getting into our sleeping bags, my friend pulls out her cell phone to see if she had any reception. Nothing still. She tried to dial her boyfriend just in case, and I remember saying out loud, "We have no reception out here, it won't work." We laid there in silence, watching her phone trying to dial out, but it discontinued. And if that was not the perfect fucking cue, suddenly about maybe 20 feet off to the left of our tent, there were footsteps. These weren't footsteps that quietly built up. These were footsteps like someone had been standing behind the tree near our tent and started walking towards us. Those crunchy leaves were doing their job. We fucking froze. Just stared at each other, eyes wide. The footsteps continued to walk towards the tent, then turned to go behind for maybe a couple of yards, and then they stopped. Silence again. These were heavy booted footprints, with the same pattern that would be a person walking, not a bear or a deer. My friend grabbed my knife that was laying by my bag and grabbed her headlamp too. She unzips the tent and goes out and stands in front of the tent, knife out, looking around the area. She's a goddamn warrior. It was maybe 45 seconds of silence as we listened for more footsteps or voices. I could see the light from my friend's headlamp dashing around the trees, but there was nothing there. She stuck her head back into the tent and said, "We're getting the fuck out of here." And then we in record time packed up everything of ours in probably 10 minutes and flew out of there. I'm amazed, thinking back on it, how we didn't lose our heads. We kept our cool while packing, but still internally screaming in terror. We only had our headlamps on, and the whole time we were packing up I kept thinking about how somebody would come up behind us and grab us and pull us into the darkness, and we would be completely helpless if they did. It didn't feel like it was really happening. Maybe that's why we were almost completely calm while packing. Like there's no way this is actually happening on our first night camping. We must just be freaking ourselves out. I still felt like we were being watched though, but we spat out of there once done. Now here is where it's all confirmed. As we pulled out of the campsite, there were 2 black dirty trucks pulled off to the side of the road, almost hidden in the trees but still clearly visible. They had definitely not been there when we pulled in either, and the closest residential homes were maybe 15 miles away. We didn't see anyone around them, but we didn't stop to look. We got to a motel and stayed a night there and told the story to the motel owner, who was amazingly sweet and comforting, and even gave us some cash when we left the next morning for us to use at another motel if we needed. I promised that man I would give him a good review. I will remember every detail of that night for the rest of my life. The feeling like we were being watched, hearing the footsteps so close to us suddenly, the black trucks. If anyone out there is a good writer, I would love to have someone put this into writing for me, but I'm a terrible writer and this post itself is probably god-awful. Don't go to White Rocks Campground. I was working in a summer camp, and one day when we were on minimal staff, I happened to be the only person in camp. Cell phone reception was terrible up in the mountains, so I had gone to one of the cabins to use a landline and chat after work. Heading back to my cabin at the end of twilight, I get to the flagpole and there's a large black bear. It's heading past the swimming pool, making a beeline for the dumpster. I stop in my tracks, thinking, oh crap, a bear. The bear stops and looks at me, and I could swear it was thinking, oh crap, a human. So the two of us face off for a few seconds. Either my flashlight made its eyes sting, or the bear realized my scent was all over the place. It made a right turn and ambled up the slope into the wilderness. That bear still returned on a regular basis to tip over the dumpster in hopes of getting a snack, which never succeeded because we used bear bars. So each morning, one of the chores was to lift up the dumpster and see where the tracks had come from. This scared the shit out of the kids. I ended up with the most badass reputation in camp because every little kid soon found out that I had faced a bear alone. No kid talked back to me. The one occasion where they did try, another kid stopped it by exclaiming, "That's the bear lady." I can't say I was sorry that reputation happened. Discipline was easier, especially when people noticed that when I changed cabins, the bear changed its route through the camp to avoid me. After it retreated once, its instinct thought of me as dominant, so it didn't want another conflict. All because I had stood there like an idiot holding a flashlight at a bear. Better decision than flying into panic, I guess, as things turned out. I posted this story on a similar thread a while back. Some buddies and I went camping by the lake one night. At about 1:30 a.m., we heard some rustling in the bushes and just figured it was a rabbit or something. We went over to check it out and found nothing. But about 5 minutes later, a huge pickup truck that was lifted and blaring loud music drove by on a dirt road really, really slowly, shining a huge police-grade spotlight on me and my friends. The truck burned out and kept driving. So, my best friend and I decided to drive up the road and see if we spot anything unusual about the truck. We get to the main road, and there are probably 7 or 8 cop cars, lights flashing, and 2 or 3 ambulances. We stop to turn around, and, I swear, like a damn horror film, a cop pecks on my window with his flashlight out of nowhere. He asks what we're doing, and we told him we were camping and told him about the truck. He says, "Well, you boys might want to camp somewhere else. We had a homicide here and haven't located the suspect." My friend says, "So should we be scared?" Like a damn idiot. And the cop says, and I quote, "Well, I'm not scared, but there are 20 officers here and we all have guns." I said, "Yes, sir," and tore off back down the campsite. My best friend called the rest of our buddies and told them to pack up the gear, no questions asked, and that we had to get out. We literally threw 2 fully pitched tents in the back of one of our trucks and got the hell out of there. The cops located the killer about 30 minutes later at our campsite. Last summer, I road tripped across the US solo for 2 months. I left Crater Lake heading to California later than I'd planned and was planning to camp wherever. My gas light had been on for 30 miles and there hadn't been any services, so I was getting a little nervous. I saw a sign for a campground and I figured I could talk to whoever was camping there to find out how far away gas was and maybe sleep there for the night. It was an old logging site, so the road there was super rough and very far from the main road. I pulled in and there was a mid to late 20s couple at the very first site. I said hello and asked if they knew the area. I got a sense of genuine friendliness from them, and they told me that the nearest gas station was only 2 miles away, but that it had closed for the night. The site next to them was open, and they suggested that I take it. I started setting up my tent and was using a rock to get my stakes into the ground when the guy showed up with his hand axe and offered to help. Creepy, but helpful. I asked if he drank and offered him a beer as a neighborly gesture. His wife or girlfriend came over and asked if I had any pills. Just some ibuprofen, but why don't you have some weed I picked up in Washington? They reminded me to pay for my site at the self-serve box, more than once. This seemed like a red flag, so I said I didn't have any cash. They said I could just write my credit card information down and put it in the box. 1,000 red flags. The woman wanted to introduce me to the neighbors, so she took me to an RV that looked like it had been parked there for multiple months. Cardboard over wheels, dirty, all that. And inside was a very drunk man, somewhere over 60, a woman who insisted on feeding me the tacos she was cooking, and a dog looking at me like maybe I had food in my pockets. The drunk man started a very long story that wound up being a joke, with the punchline being Jeffrey Dahmer cannibalism based at the moment that the older woman handed me a taco. I stated I had to check on something, got the fuck out of the trailer, tossed the taco to the dog that followed me, and proceeded to crack open a beer to put together a plan. These people were messed up, but I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, like I had some time. I decided to shoot the breeze with the guy from the first couple, and the way he described it, they'd been camping for 2 weeks because money ran out. Pretty soon, I heard the old woman yelling at the man in the "that's it, I've had it" vein. I'd stated that I was thinking about heading over to the gas station to see if it was actually closed, just so I could get a few more miles done for the day. The old lady comes over to where Dude and I were standing and says, "He's really done it this time. Next ride into town that comes my way, I'm gonna take it." I sip my beer. The younger woman says to me, "I can ride with you to the gas station just so you find it." I take a much larger sip of my beer. I'm starting to get really uncomfortable from all of this. I make up some shit excuse to go back to my site and rip up my tarp, tent, and fly altogether, shove it in the back of my car and get the fuck out of there. I made it to the gas station, which was indeed closed, but had passed a charming B&B less than a mile before. I explained to the desk clerk that I had a very weird encounter at a campsite and would be sleeping in my car in the lot for the night. She wanted to sell me a room far outside my budget and wound up offering the use of the bathrooms and morning coffee. I filled up my tank in the morning and bid farewell to that place. My wife, dog, and myself, second day of an 80-kilometer hike in northern Ontario. It was around Killarney Provincial Park. We set up camp on a point 750 meters into a lake. One way onto the point and one way off the point. We were hearing wolves since about 9 p.m. and we went to bed by 10 and the howls were getting closer and closer. Then one howled right from behind us on the trail down to the point. I got out of the tent and started making lots of noise trying to scare it off. This usually works for bears, whom we have had lots of encounters with. I didn't see anything there and didn't hear anything else either. I went back to bed and laid down, trying to act confident to not upset my wife. Then, when we both heard something outside of the tent, my dog was crazy quiet but shaking. I opened the tent to find a wolf staring at me from about 15 feet away. I grabbed the bear spray and took aim. I didn't use it, but I again started screaming at the wolf and took a few charges towards it. Again, this usually works when faced with a black bear if you have no escape. The wolf didn't seem to really care, though, that I was yelling at it. It kind of hung out for a few seconds, then kind of very casually walked into the tree line just far enough that I couldn't see it anymore. I built a fire between the tent and the bush, sat up, and kept my headlamp on all night. I had to listen to 3 or 4 wolves howl to each other all night about every 20 minutes. They were very close. The one I would estimate to be within 50 yards. I was sure they were going to come and grab my dog. At about 6 a.m., a bunch of them started howling all together way more than during the night, but it sounded like 8 to 10 wolves. We waited until about 8 a.m., then packed up and got the fuck out of there. We were 36 kilometers in, and it took us 2 days to hike in. We hiked out in 6.5 hours. About 1.5 hours into our hike out, the wolves started howling behind us again. They were still following us. On the hike out, we saw a bear with 2 cubs. This would usually concern us a bit, but we were just wanting to get the fuck out of there. My wife lost all of her toenails from the hike, and my poor dog got some serious anxiety about being in the tent. I was camping with 2 college friends way the hell out in the mountains of Trinity County in far northern California. It wasn't an established campsite, just a nice spot many miles down a dirt road off the main highway Route 299, which is largely isolated to begin with. There might not have been another soul for miles. This is a very rural and rugged area, and it's part of a region where a lot of weed is cultivated illegally, which can sometimes make it dangerous. We got to this spot late in the day, a nice little clearing along a stream, and set up camp. As we sat around the fire after dark, shooting the shit like usual, a large animal suddenly exploded out of the brush and seemed to stop right outside our fire circle. But then we didn't hear it leave. Not even a twig cracking. It was gone, though. We searched all around with our lights. It seemed very unusual to all of us that this animal would arrive so loudly. We listened to it approach for several oh shit seconds, but then make no discernible noise retreating. My one friend, who was sort of a local, said he thought it was a puma for that reason. A tad unnerving, but okay. We laughed it off, drank beer, and eventually crashed out, with one friend and I in a 2-person tent and the other, the local who grew up in the backwoods, in a tiny single-person tent next to us. We fell fast asleep for at least a few hours. Out of nowhere in the middle of the night, I woke the fuck up. There were several footsteps right outside of our tents. I don't know why, but I felt a very strong intuition not to call out to my friend in the other tent to check if it was him, even though him going out to take a piss would be the obvious explanation. I'd gone camping with these guys countless times. And then, the person walking called out, and I almost shat myself. It wasn't my friend. It was just some random guy. He circled our tents for the next 5 minutes calling, "Hello? Hello?" He said it over and over in a disconcerting, calm, and measured voice. Remember, this was in the middle of the night, way the fuck out in the middle of nowhere. I had this crazy gut feeling to stay absolutely silent and wait for an attack, which I did, knife in hand. My friend and my tent slept through it all. The weird guy left no sound of a vehicle or anything, and somehow dawn arrived. The next day, the first thing I did was ask my buddy in tent number 2 whether he heard that dude walking around, and he did. He had the same instinct as me. My other friend, who had been sleeping next to me, was obviously confused. He said, "What the fuck? Why didn't you wake me up? It's like we'll help the guy out or kick his ass." I couldn't explain it, but the other friend backed me up right away. He said it was super creepy, and the way the guy was moving and speaking had a really weird vibe. This friend wasn't the type to get scared or the type you would expect not to confront someone in that situation. So my tent mate just let it be, and we all just basked for a few minutes in the WTF-ness of it all. One of the little mysteries of my life that I always look back on is what that guy wanted and what would have happened if we had responded or, burst out of our tents. It's not easy to burst out of a zipped-up tent, and who knows, maybe in that case the little hung-up saved our asses. I don't really know if I camp enough to answer this, or if it's the strange that you're looking for, but one year my friend invited me to stay up in the woods at this old campsite he went to every year with his family. It was fun. We fished and went swimming and everything. And one night we had this little bonfire and made s'mores. The normal camping stuff. But then, at 2 a.m, someone whistled the Hunger Games call. Me, being an avid whistler, one of my few skills, whistled the return call. They did it again. I did it again. The campsite had maybe 40 people in it, and everyone was in tents except for me and my friend and the whistler. So this went on for about 5 minutes, and the whistles devolved into random noises and counter melodies until I got fed up and decided to find them. So I stood up and walked into the forest, barefoot, no flashlight, a total fool. Now, I didn't want to call out to them because that would be too easy, so instead I slunk through the forest quietly, trying to hone in on the whistle. It took about 20 minutes before my friend realized we were going too far away from camp and should head back, but I had to frickin' find them. A couple of minutes later we reached a little clearing. There was a cliff that ran down into the lake and a couple of trees that had fallen over, and there were 3 kids just sitting out looking at the lake. I called to them, saying that I'd been looking for them and how fun the whistling was, and who they were, but they didn't respond. They just sat there and looked at the lake. It was positively eerie, and they didn't even seem to hear me. I didn't want to get any closer to them than a couple of feet, and I especially didn't want to spook them and have them demon throw me over the cliff or something. As soon as we got back to our campsite, there was no more whistling. Very creepy. In the morning, I asked people if they had heard us, and they said no, so I guess everyone is just a super heavy sleeper or something. I made an account just to tell this story. I'm from the Iroquois Reservation in Ontario, Canada. It's almost like you can ask anyone from around here if they've experienced any kind of paranormal stuff, and they usually have a story to tell. My culture and heritage is filled with stories of otherworldly beings and creatures, and stories of how things came to be before Europeans inhabited the territory. I'm naturally skeptical about a lot of what people say they see out here in the bush, as I've hunted the territory my entire life. I've come across a lot of things in the bush some might consider paranormal, like various animal cries and howls, owls flying at low light, decomposing animals in the water, etc. This particular time, though, I wasn't hunting. My family homestead is situated almost a half-kilometer into the bush. It was early summer just as the fireflies were coming out. A belief of the Iroquois is that fireflies are a sign that Indian medicine is at its most powerful this time of year, good and bad. So I get home from work a little after midnight. I turn off the car and get out to start walking up the path to the house. Normal routine. This night, though, I stop to look at the fireflies up on the hill behind my home. It looks absolutely amazing. So my porch wraps around the house, and I walk to the back of the house and start walking slowly up the hill. All of a sudden, I think I hear some beating sound like music, and I look back to see if my car radio was still on. From a distance, I could see the car was off and no sound was coming from that direction. So I walk up to the top of the hill, and that's when the sound gets louder. I start to hear it clearly. From the top of the hill looking down onto the other side into the bushline, I no longer see any fireflies. All I hear is the faint sound of a water drum beating and a low, raspy voice singing an old Indian song. I just turned around and went inside and tried to convince myself I wasn't crazy. It was the only spiritual experience I've ever had in my entire life, and I go out back to that spot every summer and lay down tobacco and cedar for my visitor. I've posted this before, but it didn't get much love, so here it is again. I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new hunting camera and wanted to test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with my two other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of seeing wildlife, he would see some lovely butt cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind, and after some convincing, my other two cousins were in as well. But we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 a.m. and pass out. By 3:15, we all sneak outside, throw on our headlamps and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills, and the camera is in a valley on the other side of the second hill. We start walking as normal, and everything is good. The excitement starts building, and we're all pretty giddy that we're about to pull this glorious prank. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. My older cousin, who knows the area more than me, stops as he gets to the top. As I make my way to the top myself, I see why. Off in the distance, about 400 yards, is a spotlight. Its bluish-white color illuminates nearly half of the hill at its point. This thing was crazy bright. By this time, all 3 of us were looking at the light, and my older cousin tells us to turn off our headlamps. We stand there in silence. Me, being the 13-year-old pussy I was, started to get freaked out. Aliens is the first thing that comes to my mind, and I tell my oldest cousin we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp again and turn around about to head back to the campsite. As soon as I turn my headlamp back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing or movement from the light besides just a slow, constant pan right over towards our direction, just inching as slowly as possible. At that point, I nope the fuck out, with my cousins right behind. I get inside and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to the next morning, all 3 of us go back to the same spot, and then proceeded to go down where we thought the light would have been, and there was nothing there. No boot marks, no light, no nothing. To this very day, I still have no idea what it was. This was just a couple of weeks ago. I was camping with my sister in a state park, and for privacy we had to pick a spot away from the road and near a bit of drop in the terrain that was separated from our site by a couple of downed trees. I was having problems getting to sleep because it was cold and I had a headache. This was later in the season than we normally would have camped, and my sleeping bag was only rated to 40 degrees. It was in the mid-30s. It was about 3 a.m., and I was trying to get warm and find a position that wouldn't aggravate my headache. I heard something moving outside. There had been a bit of wind earlier in the evening, and things had been dropping from the trees. However, the wind was dead quiet now. I could hear every leaf crunch, so I knew there was something out there. My mind was racing and my body was shaking, from cold and fear. Was it a squirrel? No, they weren't nocturnal. Was it a bear? I didn't hear anything breathing. Then I heard the scratching. I was trying to be very still, because whatever it was very close. I didn't want to alert it to my presence. It wasn't easy since I was shaking so hard. More leaf crunches and more scratching. Then I heard the lid being pried off the tub we had outside. I knew that it was a raccoon. Now confident that it wasn't a bear, I banged on the side of the tent several times to scare it off. My sister bolted awake as I heard the tub lid tumble and more leaf crunches as it took off. After I explained to my sister what had happened, I gathered the courage to venture out to check the damage. I replaced the tub lid and found an empty hot dog bun wrapper, missing the 2 buns. There were also small holes in the garbage bag we had hanging up in a tree, but no spillage since it was double bagged. As I was surveying the area for any other damage, I could hear leaves rustling down below. I shined my flashlight down the hill to see if I could see the bandit. That's when I saw a man in a black beanie walking down the hill in the pitch black with no flashlight about 35 feet from me. I was too scared to do anything but return to the tent and try to slow my racing heart down. I went on a 16-mile hike in Arizona and climbed up a pretty easy hill. I think it was about 8,000 feet to the top and not that much gain to get there. Rookie move, I didn't have enough water for the dry altitude and my meals were freeze-dried. I hiked to the top and got there as the sun was going down. I checked my water and split some between my dog and I, and then set up a quick camp near a log. It just had a small hobo fire and a place to get some sleep so I could hike back in the morning. I didn't want to be hungry, thirsty, and wandering around in the dark because it was completely new to me, even though this was just a day hike. I had never been there before. At about 10 p.m., when it's pitch black, I hear something rustling around and making low noises getting closer, making more grunts and shuffling noises and scaring the shit out of me. I had a knife on me, but I was still pretty scared. That's really not that much protection, and I'm not Daniel Boone. And now terrified, thinking it was Bigfoot or a bear or something, I started freaking out a little bit. Mountain lions don't make noise like that. My dog was staring intently in its direction with his ears up as it got closer and closer, louder and louder. As soon as it got about 10 to 15 feet away, I couldn't see because there wasn't a moon, my dog finally did his damn job and got up and started barking like crazy. And then the beast let out a huge squeal of some sort and ran away. It was just a stupid javelina that I was terrified of and stole my man card for a little bit. This was years and years ago when I was just getting back into hiking, and now I always have enough water and plan my hikes accordingly. My vicious dog is now 13 and doesn't hike anymore, but he still does guard well against the vacuum. I went backpacking into the wilderness alone this summer. Things were uneventful, and I intentionally went to a place where people didn't tend to go. But just before dark, I heard the voices of 2 men muttering. No matter what I did, I couldn't see them. But I was trying to be discreet myself, so that they didn't see me either, a young girl just chilling in the wilderness completely by myself. Anyway, I never tracked down those voices, and they continued until just after nightfall. I armed myself with my weapons, made my dinner, had a fire, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything again until about 4 a.m. At that time, I began to hear the sound of what I can only describe as a baseball bat or a thick branch being hit up against a tree trunk. It happened over and over and over again in a distinct pattern until the sun came up. It came from the same exact spot as where I heard those voices, but again, I never saw anything. The next day, I'm telling my coworker about it. He's an avid outdoorsman who writes published works about backpacking in the region. He knows everything about this place. He's a logical, serious man not prone to fanciful ideas at all. He asked if anything happened, and I told him that. I finished with, "It must have been a deer rubbing its antlers on a tree, right?" He looked at me dead in the eyes and told me it sounds like what I heard was Bigfoot tree knocking. He then told me that for decades, he's been told about area sightings and encounters with a Bigfoot type of creature. This happened about half a mile away from where I was. Great. So, it was either two creepy men fucking with me, or the New York Bigfoot. Either way, creepy and uncool. Where I live, there are huge swaths of forest and land that is miles and miles from any sort of civilization. Being a good old country boy, I spent a lot of time camping along the DNR roads. One year, we camped out on the side of a little mountain and spent the night drinking and whatnot. The next morning, nobody wanted to cook, so we decided to drive into town, approximately 20 miles away, for breakfast. As we were exiting the forest, we came upon a police blockade. The sheriffs had their AR rifles pointed at us and told us to park the vehicle and walk towards them with our hands in the air. We followed instructions and they told us that a forest ranger had been shot the previous night. I later found out that she was shot about 300 feet below our campsite. We probably heard the gun, but in that part it wasn't unusual for people to be shooting in the area. We were told that we couldn't go back for our camp gear as the killer was still on the loose. Instead, we drove to a nearby casino and got back to the revelry. A few hours later, the gas station next to the casino is packed with sheriffs, PD, FBI, every LEO within 50 miles must have been there. As it turns out, the killer was spotted at the gas station, and an officer who happened to be there recognized him. When the LEO told him to get on the ground, the killer reached for his gun, at which point the LEO shot and killed him. It was so strange that we were within a few hundred feet of where he had killed someone, and hours later a few hundred feet from where he was ultimately killed. We drove back to our campsite that night a little sombered, and proceeded to get shit-faced.